It's been a little over a year since I wrote this article, but the content remains relevant, especially as the United States continues to amp up its propaganda against China and Asian Americans. There are many lessons to learn here, especially with regard to media analysis and how the ruling class directs narratives using compromised journalists. For example, in 2018, I looked up Huffington Post's now defunct Asian Voices section to see who their writers were, and I found that they were all Asian women and white men. The same thing happened when I investigated who were the mods of the subreddit Asian American. And once the Huffington Asian Voices went defunct, guess where the editors went? NBC Asian America, which has gaslighted Asian Americans throughout the pandemic for the past 3 years. Asian American women represent an overwhelming majority of the journalists in mainstream media. There are also many more Asian women writers in Hollywood than there are male ones. This is not an accident. While there is an element of white men hiring Asian women for their own misogynistic purposes, it also is considered more progressive in liberal circles to hire women over men, despite the fact that Asians have been poorly represented in the media as a whole. Even most of the Asian men in the mainstream media are essentially cucked eunuchs serving the American media machine, which merely parrot mainstream narratives about Asian Americans. The first step in countering false narratives is understanding how these narratives are built and disseminated. Here, I try to not only deconstruct the incentives in the white man Asian female phenomena, but how it bleeds into the perception and control of the narrative of the Asian American community as a whole. This topic has been on my mind for over 20 years, and this article represents the culmination of my observations. However, I don't go more into the nuances of the dating scene, since the political ramifications are too important not to tackle first. I'll probably tackle this topic on a later episode since you guys are harassing me about it, okay, I get it. You want to know what the dating stuff is. What later, okay? Okay, so then with that, let's just jump in. On January 15, 2019, 3 Asian men were murdered in a cold-blooded hammer attack at a Chinese restaurant in Brooklyn. Tang Kong Ing, a 61-year-old Malaysian immigrant, was struck over the head, spilling blood over the counter. Zi Pun, 51, part owner of the Chinese restaurant, had his skull smashed in. Fu Lai Pun, 34, nephew of Zi Pun, who had worked as a chef since he was a teenager, was repeatedly bludgeoned. The assailant was Arthur Martinovich, a 34-year-old white man, who specifically targeted Asian men for murder. Afterwards, when asked why he committed these horrific crimes, he would say that he watched movies that portrayed Asian men being so cruel to Asian women that he had to step in and save Asian women by killing Asian men. Chinese men are awful. They hold their women captive, and their women have real inaudible ability, and that's why they have to keep them captive, Martinovich said to police after his arrest. Last August, murder charges were dropped against Martinovich, as the judge in charge of the case found him mentally unstable. At the height of tensions over anti-Asian racism, this ruling seemed to be a slap in the face to the Asian American community. Only curiously enough, Asian American journalists would never utter a word on the matter. The journalists who covered the story were non-Asian and even posited the question, was it even a hate crime? Why was there neglect on what constituted a clear hate crime against Asian Americans? Instead, some Asian American journalists seem to be more interested in another topic entirely, boosting Aaron Mack's recent expose of men's rights Asians. The topic of white adjacency, colonialism, and interracial relationships has been a contentious one in the Asian American community for decades, and the article's release started weeks of mudslinging from Asian men and women on both sides of the debate. With so many recent changes on the American dialogue on race, many of the article's assertions were outdated or misrepresented Asian Americans. As someone who's closely followed Asian American history and media and how the Asian American gender divide manifested, I felt compelled to share my analysis and thoughts. Before I begin, I find it necessary to start with a disclaimer, seeing as countless times Asian Americans with platforms would weaponize the MRAsian term against me and its baseless ad hominem in order to service their own platforms and arguments in bad faith. Look, I don't care at all who dates whom I have plenty of Asian friends and family, both men and women, who have white partners. I do not want to control Asian women's bodies for the sake of my own sexual pleasure. I am more or less satisfied with my dating life, okay? What I do care about are the ways in which some Asian Americans in media contribute to Orientalist stereotypes or the silencing of other Asian Americans. In the past few years, the conversation around East and Southeast Asian Americans and gender has been thrust in the mainstream. While most Asians have an inkling that our gender issues cannot be mapped onto the general American experience, there's a lack of consensus as to how gender affects our personal and political lives. Asians are rapidly becoming more visible as a critical mass of second and beyond generations Asians have come to age to finally contribute to the greater cultural conversation. However, because American media has long controlled our narrative, much of our conversations in the mainstream have been filtered through the lens of white supremacy. Attempts to find a unified voice have been clumsy at best. Even with more Asian writers today, white editors can ultimately choose what and what not to print for the mainstream audience. Since Asians don't have any Asian-only run publications with a significant audience, the Asian narrative is still controlled by white media. It behooves any Asian to really question what the narrative is trying to do for our communities. Hint, it's not to try to unify or help us. One of the biggest misconceptions about Asians in mainstream media is that we're all ultimately one homogenous Borg. This has made it easy for the media to target all Asians as a monolith. An enemy to be feared, yellow peril, Japanese internment camps, model minorities to squelch concerns about systemic racism, racist minorities who are complicit in upholding white supremacy, and scapegoats to blame whenever things go wrong, like COVID-19 or affirmative action. By contrast, Asians are actually the most heterogeneous group in America. As a relatively newer immigrant group in terms of magnitude, there are natural divisions. There are divisions between generations, marked by cultural and language barriers, divisions between dozens of different Asian countries and their respective cultures and conflicts, and then there are divisions between different socioeconomic classes, as Asian Americans represent the highest income inequality out of any other ethnic group. However, some of the Asian gender divisions have been engineered by the American government and media to divide and commodify us. In order to understand how Western media has shaped and controlled the narrative of Asian gender relations, we have to first look at the history of America's structural racism against Asians and how the men and women were impacted very differently. Prior to the 20th century, America initially used Chinese men as a discardable source of cheap labor to build the railroads. Chinese men were banned from bringing wives from their respective countries due to the Page Act of 1875, and because of strict miscegenation laws, Chinese men were not allowed to start families with white men. To add insult to injury, America later passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, making it illegal for these Chinese immigrants to naturalize. Many Chinese men had no families or community life as a result. So Chinese laborers, uncredited and paid next to nothing for building the railroad, needed to be excised from America. By the mid-20th century, during World War II and Cold War conflicts around the Pacific, American GIs encountered Asian women during their tours and wanted to bring them over as brides. However, since miscegenation laws were still in effect, the War Brides Act of 1945 was passed to legalize interracial marriages for the first time. For the next 20 years, miscegenation laws were repealed until Loving v. Virginia in 1967, which made interracial marriages legal across the country. Let me restate. It was white male desire for Asian women that started the push towards interracial marriage in America. In addition, America began to actively portray this specific interracial pairing in order to normalize it to the greater American public. I can't help but laugh at this jealous white woman in this poster. There were real material incentives for Asian women to marry white men. Many of these women, who had just had their homelands destroyed or ravaged, understandably took the opportunity to marry and come over to America. Even domestically during World War II, when Japanese men, women, children, and the elderly were all put into the internment camps, there was one exception: Japanese women with white husbands. The implication was that unless vetted by a white man, an Asian was not a true American. Therein lies the ugly truth. Ever since Asian women were allowed to step foot onto this country, America has created tangible incentives for them to date white men. In addition, Hollywood and the media adjusted the way it portrayed Asian men. Prior to World War II, Asian men were portrayed in similar racist tropes as black men, hypermasculine and sexually deviant. In conjunction with the narrative of Asian women being suitable wives, the media started to highlight Asian men working in traditionally feminine jobs in order to present the idea that white men were in more masculine and more lucrative roles in society. This is Sesue Hayakawa. He's usually cast as a villain in Hollywood, and he was considered attractive to white men prior to World War II. Continued conflicts in Asia during the Cold War and the Immigration Act of 1965 brought over a new wave of Asian immigrants, many who came from poor countries without knowing English or anything about American culture, much less the prior history of discrimination Asians faced in America. The first-generation immigrants had no access or voice in American media, which opened the door for white men to have full control over the Asian narrative. Stories would either lean into offensive stereotypes, fetishizing Asian women, or romanticize white male saviorism of Asian women. By the turn of the century, results from the media propaganda surfaced. American-born Asian women had the highest interracial marrying rate out of any ethnic group, over 54%. While the outright marrying rate is also high for second-generation Asian men, 38%, the statistics don't account for how many Asian men remain unmarried because of bias in the general American dating market. Online dating has made things worse for Asian men. A recent OkCupid study, now curiously deleted, but you can find references to it, revealed the obvious, that a white man in America is the most desirable overall in dating. It also found that for an Asian man to be equivalent to a white man in the general dating pool, he would have to earn $250,000 a year more than a white man. The incentives of dating white men still exist today just by virtue of white men being in proximity to wealth and power in America. In media and politics, right-wing white men are married to the most influential Asians, such as Elaine Chao, Amy Chua, Julie Chen Moonves, and Wendy Den Murdoch. It's also no secret that the alt-right has an Asian fetish, e.g., libertarians with Asian wives and Tila Tequila, a self-proclaimed Nazi sympathizer. Sometimes, marrying white is even encouraged by immigrant Asian parents, with the practical idea of upward mobility. There are still sexpats who bring home Asian wives from poor Asian countries. In liberal coastal cities, where many Asians reside, a fair amount of second-generation Asian women work in industries such as politics, tech, finance, law, and media. These industries are dominated by white men, especially politics and media, so it's understandable that many Asian women in these industries date those around them, who also happen to be in positions of power and privilege. So, do some Asians have a problem with certain Asian women based solely on their dating choices? Or is there something else going on here? My own journey in entertainment and media revealed to me that not only was the government and the media responsible for these divisions, they started to amplify Asian voices in media that would spread Orientalists' ideas about Asia and Asian men for them. During my high school years in the late 90s and early 2000s, even while the internet was still in its nascent forms and Reddit did not exist, my Asian guy friends and I were well aware of yellow fever. Asian women were seen as desirable, while the men were not, and the white man-Asian women pairing was seen as not only natural, but preferable to Asian women. Asian self-hate was palpable and out in the open back then. Half-white, half-Asian people were regarded as superior to full Asians, since they came out better looking. I remember someone remarking that a half-white Asian we knew was like Blade, all our strengths and none of our weaknesses. As recently as a decade ago, it was actually socially acceptable for an Asian woman to proudly say they'd never date an Asian guy and exclusively date white men. A common reason given at the time for some Asian women was that Asian men reminded them of their cousins/brothers. One wonders how China has 1.4 billion citizens with this logic. With the media continually portraying white men as heroes, Who could blame Asian women for being attracted to what was demonstrated to be desirable and popular? White worship was not only out in the open, but encouraged. My personal reaction to this at the time was apathy with a tinge of annoyance. All of the girls I was attracted to were Asians, who were actually into Asians, so in my view, it didn't affect my personal life. I had no interest in dating outside my own race, since as a minority, I prioritized shared lived experiences in a relationship. However, later on, after pursuing a career in entertainment, I started to recognize that racism directly affected how Asian men were portrayed in the media, mainly as either foreigners who knew kung fu or dickless nerds set up as the punchline of a joke. In 2015, a few years after I had moved to LA in pursuit of an acting career, I became frustrated as there were still no roles for Asians and the few roles were mostly stereotypes. I was inspired and decided to write and create my own show, Just Doug, both in an effort to launch my career and to create media that gave depth to Asian personalities and storylines. Come for the masturbation scenes? Stay for the penis analysis. As I was spitballing story ideas with my co-writer, he recounted one of his friend's experiences. As an Asian guy at the bar, an Asian woman said to him, "You're not my type. I don't date Asian guys." What was worse was that it was unsolicited, as if she was already preempting him to say, "Don't even try, buddy." I had never personally heard something with such wanton vitriol. So I began to research and figure out why the discrepancy between the dating lives of Asian men and women was so apparent. Tinder for Asian women was like shooting fish in a barrel, whereas for Asian men, it was a long-distance marathon for their thumbs. Every Asian man in America has had penis anxiety. Immersed in white media, you start to believe stereotypes yourself. Do I have a small dick? Is it true? Are we really cursed? In my research of the relationship between ethnicity and penis size, I came across some interesting tidbits. Japanese porn producers purposely choose men with smaller than average penises to make the viewer comfortable, as Japanese culture is more discreet about sex than American culture. White immigrants, such as Irish and Jews, were given the small penis stereotype when they first arrived as well. And a French doctor in the 19th century was responsible for classifying different penis sizes for different ethnic groups with questionable measuring methodologies. In Just Doug, I wanted to bring up uncomfortable conversations that Asians have in their personal lives. When Doug gets rejected by an Asian woman, it's ambiguous as to the reason why, just as the reasons are complex in real life. I wanted to explore and deconstruct pre-existing false binaries and inconsistencies, and to potentially start honest dialogue within our community, and the greater public at large about our social issues. Part of my marketing strategy was to contact any Asian journalist who had written about whitewashing. I was able to put the show on Facebook Watch as one of their first narrative shows, as well as get placements in The Verge, HuffPo, and Washington Post. However, I was disappointed when many of the Asian culture writers and journalists I reached out to blithely pretended the show did not exist. One journalist contacted me showing interest in showcasing the show, then mysteriously ghosted my emails afterwards. Another, a friend of mine who wrote for a well-known Hollywood trade, admitted to me that she did not watch it because it was not an official Hollywood project. I couldn't help but feel that it was strange that I was being shut out by the very people who claimed to want more of what I had just produced. Did I potentially touch a nerve with some Asian gatekeepers by talking explicitly about Asian interracial dating trends? I received a better response from grassroots marketing, Twitter and Reddit. At the time, I was fairly apolitical, and I rarely engaged with either platform until I stumbled upon Asian subreddits such as r/Asian American and r/Asian Identity. As I posted my show to these subs, I was exposed to conversations about Asian history, politics, and its media class for the first time. While r/Asian American parroted many of the narratives of mainstream media, r/Asian Identity took a different approach and was unafraid to push the envelope and debate topics that weren't covered by the mainstream, such as questions of Eurocentrism, when the romantic comedy Crazy Rich Asians cast a half-white Asian, the thorny topic of discrimination against Asians in high school and college admissions due to opaque affirmative action policies, and the nature in which Asian countries were colonized by America. Unsurprisingly, r/aznidentity responded well to the countercultural nature of my show. I started to engage more with the subreddit, and noticed that while some of the conversations around dating were toxic and misguided, much of the anger and rage seemed to come from a feeling of powerlessness. At the center of the debate about Asian women and white men was the question of agency. While Asian women are not responsible for yellow fever and their fetishization, relationships are a two-way street. Do Asian women bear any responsibilities for perpetuating stereotypes by exclusively dating white men? Or worse, publicly announcing that they were doing so because they found Asian men repulsive? Despite the fact that there are now much more Asians in media, it is still easy for the media to control the Asian narrative because we have no unified community, much less a voice or platform independent from the mainstream. As Asians became aware of the problematic nature of stories written by white men, like Miss Saigon, the media started to pivot to a much more effective strategy of cherry-picking and amplifying certain Asian voices that align with their interests and dismissing the ones that challenge their authority. By creating and co-opting an Asian media class, the media could effectively shape and control the Asian narrative by filtering and using simple incentives. Sometimes, the Asians who are amplified don't even have an underlying agenda themselves, but are simply sharing their own lived experience. I have no doubt that Amy Tan's life experiences mirrored that of the Joy Luck Club. But while the movie was celebrated for being the first American studio film with a majority Asian cast, it contained exclusively negative portrayals of Asian men, while portraying white male partners as desirable and progressive. More recently, in 2018, Jenny Han's To All the Boys I've Loved Before originally was written to have 5 white male love interests for the main character, who was a half Asian girl. To Han's credit, she listened to the criticism and voiced regret, saying that she could only tell the stories that she knew as she grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood without Asian men. Sometimes, it's more explicit. The former Asian Voices section at Huffington Post only employed Asian women and white men writers. Jen Fang, an Asian culture writer, wrote an article that blamed the Isla Vista killings on toxic Asian masculinity, despite the fact that Elliot Rodger killed Asian men, and no Asian women, because of his anger at white women. Going even deeper, I found journalists and comedians who've made a living by shitting on Asian men, leaning onto the Orientalist stereotypes that Asian men are inherently more misogynistic than enlightened white men in the West. Rosalind Talisan, for example, who has written for various publications such as Vice, has a clear vendetta against Asian men, and for a good part of a decade. This conversation was suddenly thrust in the mainstream in 2018 when tweets by Celeste Ng, a novelist of Bad Art Friend fame, you can look that up on the New York Times, surfaced that stated that she did not find Asian men attractive. When you have to reassure your non-Asian audience that you do not, in fact, find Asian men attractive. Twice. There was a firestorm on both Twitter and Reddit, where many Asians demanded a response and answers for these tweets. However, things got out of control when Ng received targeted harassment in the form of vicious emails. It was unclear as to who was directly responsible, but r/aznidentity, who was the most visible subreddit that criticized Ng, was accused. My guess was that while some of the harassment probably came from r/aznidentity, the majority probably also came from more toxic subreddits such as r/Hapas and r/Eastern Sun Rising. These subreddits promoted extreme ideas of Asian supremacy, racial purity, and the trauma some Asian experienced from white male Asian female relationships. Ng, in response, wrote an article decrying all of the harassment she received. While Ng had very valid points about r/aznidentity, some of the framing was a little disingenuous. The article's title insinuates that the primary reason Asian men, who she called MRAsians, or men's rights Asians, were harassing her solely because she was a visible woman in media dating a white man. Anyone who even remotely disagreed with her, even if they were an Asian woman, became a harasser, and consequently an MRAsian. When Asian-founded publications like Plan A and Next Shark attempted to give more balanced takes on the situations. She labeled them MRAsian as well. MRAsian just became an effective way to discredit any Asian by immediately connecting them to a right-wing ideology to outsiders looking in. To be fair to Ng, the controversy brought a lot of confusion, and there may have been no real way to discern who was coming in good faith. I don't doubt that she faced terrible treatment by some extreme Asian men. However, by the virtue of her platform, Ng had successfully positioned herself as a morally correct side, and anyone who revisited the conversation ran the risk of being labeled a misogynistic incel. The damage was done. By popularizing the idea that r/aznidentity was a right-wing incel-adjacent movement during the height of the Me Too movement, the subreddit and its community were all implicated and smeared. Many, including myself, decided it best to leave the conversation and r/aznidentity entirely. For the next few years, the discussion about the Asian gender issues would remain cold. In 2020, Asian America had a more important crisis on its hand, a twin pandemic of the coronavirus and violent anti-Asian hate crimes which targeted many Asian senior citizens. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the majority of the anti-Asian hate crimes were being committed in cities with high Asian populations, such as San Francisco and New York City. The uncomfortable truth was that while the majority of the verbal anti-Asian harassment from the hate crimes were from white offenders in wealthier suburban areas, many of the violent hate crimes in urban, poorer areas were caused by non-white assailants. Intuitively, it made sense. Asians are among some of the poorest and largest communities in cities like New York City and San Francisco. As the pandemic raised pre-existing racial tensions and exacerbated economic conditions for the lower class, Asians were targeted for robberies, assault, and murder for the simple fact that Asians were not being protected by the police. Personally, I've taken it upon myself to parse through these difficult issues with Asians and other black people. With coronavirus and the George Floyd protests happening in tandem, I wrote this piece for Next Shark early in the pandemic, fearing that the media would manipulate the narrative to pit Asian and black people against each other, just as they spun the narrative about the LA riots in 1992. They did. You can find this thread on Twitter. This thread is a primer on how the media turned the LA riots from a police brutality issue into a Korean versus black one. For more, I've also included a link to the LA riots documentary in the comments below that I directed earlier this year. The media portrayed the George Floyd protests as equivalent to the mass destruction of Korean neighborhoods in LA. Koreans in 1992 were portrayed as anti-black alt-right white supremacists, not desperate citizens in fear for their lives. Meanwhile, black protesters, despite many peaceful protests and demonstrations, were portrayed as mostly opportunistic looters and criminals. The result? Many Asian-owned small businesses were totaled, while big corporate outlets remained relatively untouched. For African Americans, police reform has been treated as a joke by the Biden administration after the 2020 elections. Yet many Asian and black people became convinced that the other was their biggest problem in America, despite the fact that white neoliberals control the government and their police departments in all of the coastal cities. Where were the establishment Asian journalists throughout all of this? For an entire year, mainstream Asian journalists were silent on these crimes. People turned to alternative sources of news, such as Asian News and Resonate, and countless numbers of grassroots Instagram accounts. Next Shark, primarily a culture blog, began to pivot and became one of the only legitimate sources of anti-Asian hate. Worse, sources like NBC Asian America even downplayed the hate crimes, questioning if Asians were overreacting to the violence they were experiencing. Most egregious of all, there were countless nuance-free think pieces about anti-blackness within the Asian communities that only served to further inflame tensions between the minority groups. After speaking with the few Asians in media and activists who were protesting anti-Asian hate crimes in 2020, I came to the conclusion that most Asian journalists knew violent anti-Asian hate crimes were happening, but that reporting on the ones committed by non-whites would be detrimental to the optics of the Black Lives Matter movement. The silence was deafening, especially when Asian media figures would be up in arms about softball topics like white women appropriating mahjong, but failed to mention the murder of Visha Radhanapakdi. It became apparent to me that Asians in media were either staying silent to either protect their brand, or they were being silenced by their editors or the bosses. The unofficial embargo of reporting on anti-Asian hate crimes was lifted after the Atlanta spa shootings in March. It was a slam dunk opportunity to report. The assailant was a white male shooter who looked like a Proud Boy poster child in a conservative area and targeted Asian women out of clear racialized misogyny. Mainstream Asian journalists finally started to talk about anti-Asian hate, though still only in the context that only white supremacists were attacking us. Conservative outlets would then opportunistically amplify every hate crime with a black assailant, sarcastically remarking that the crime was due to white supremacy. When there is a large differential between the news and what one experiences day to day, people start to question the media. After one of the few personally trying to speak out against anti-Asian hate for the past couple years, and being frustrated with Asians in media, I connected with several Asian women on Twitter who also saw the hypocrisy of these Asian journalists. I also revisited r/Aznidentity, the only forum where people were truthfully discussing the nature of these hate crimes. It was actually a relief to see that the subreddit had actively cleaned up some of its more toxic behaviors and had a fair amount of Asian women posters as well as black members in solidarity. The board had become somewhat of a hub for a growing number of Asians who had began to distrust the mainstream media on a various number of topics. So you can imagine my surprise then when I read through Mac's Slate piece on r/Aznidentity, calling it out to be an anti-black subreddit only trolled by MRAsian incels. The subreddit was portrayed as almost comically evil, as if there were thousands of Asian men angrily gathering for the sole purpose of harassing Asian women just by virtue of their dating history to maintain racial purity. The article itself felt a bit dated, which made sense, as several interviewed for the article said Mac had reached out to them in 2019. And while I don't condone the harassment that Eileen Huang received, who was interviewed in the article frames a few details incorrectly. Huang came to the attention of the subreddit when she made her tweet, not solely when she was making TikTok videos. And the tweet in question was not made prior to the anti-Asian hate crimes. The crimes were happening since the pandemic first started, not when Asian journalists like Mac first started covering them. Mac, a tech journalist, clearly couldn't do verifiable basic research for his article, reeking of the same disingenuous half-truths contained in Ng's piece. There was no surprise then when Ng herself boosted the article, along with tweets from an obvious troll account. Either Ng is not very good at the internet, hugely influenced by confirmation bias, or is maliciously using a prop. Other prominent Asian journalists who also took it upon themselves to spread Orientalist ideas about racialized misogyny. I don't even know where to start with this one. Immediately after the article's publication, another extreme Asian group attempted to cancel Simu Liu by linking him to the r/Aznidentity subreddit without any hard evidence. This is akin to, trust me, bro. Internet sleuths would dig up a few embarrassing posts Liu made, but nothing corroborating this group's initial claims. One researcher even wrote an article suggesting that some of the Reddit evidence against Liu was fabricated. But the damage to Liu's reputation was done. Within hours, the tweet and the story went viral, the truth of which to be sorted out by the internet mobs. Upon reading Mock's piece, I questioned the purpose of the article. While Mock several times makes the assertion that r/Aznidentity is exclusively an anti-black men's rights Asian subreddit, from my limited time interacting with the forum, it seemed that there were both Asian men and women, as well as black members, to be discussing a wide variety of topics not covered by the mainstream. Mock doesn't offer any solutions beyond an insinuation that the subreddit should be shut down. Ng tweeted recently that the Asian-led publications like Next Shark and Plan A should be cancelled as well. It seemed like a coordinated assault by the establishment Asian media class to attack Asian forums and publications that were grassroots and run by Asians. Would shutting these places down really help the Asian conversation? A distinct pattern seemed to emerge. Whenever an Asian man would gain any sort of platform, they would be scrutinized for the smallest things by extreme Asian culture writers, especially if they even remotely suggested that Asian men suffer through things socially in America that Asian women do not. Even attempts at reconciliation and conversation by Asian men, such as Joshua Luna, are deemed problematic. He has been harassed for years by some of these writers and journalists. Luna, to his credit, has been nothing but professional throughout all the attacks he received. The false binary implied by many of these extreme writers was clear. If you aren't following the Asian establishment's unofficial codes of conduct, you're part of a radical right-wing incel movement. There's an asymmetrical advantage establishment Asians enjoy. When the average outsider finds an article that portrays an ethnic group a certain way, they'll take it as truth, and that group has no real chance at a rebuttal or recourse. r/aznidentity addressed the timing of the article as well, first saying that Mock had told the r/aznidentity that Slate did not want to do an article about Asian activism, until Mock pitched the article to Slate in a negative light. None of the positive things the subreddit did were published in the article, in order to give an extremely one-sided view. The editors then held off on publishing until the media cycle on anti-Asian hate died down, so as to not appear unsympathetic to Asians. Most of the dialogue about Asian identity had been free of the Asian man, white female conversation for years, until the Mock piece. All of this indicated to me that there was something deeper happening. After gaslighting Asians during the pandemic about anti-Asian racism, it seemed that the media sought to regain its control over the Asian narrative by calling into question the validity of independent Asian media organizations and figures. The prevailing thought in America is that Asians are essentially white adjacent minorities that don't go through any real discrimination, and are also an impediment towards progress for other minorities. In this framework, Asian men to the public are conferred almost all the same privileges as white men, and have a vested interest to protect their proximity to whiteness and patriarchal power. By tapping into these pre-existing Orientalists' ideas, the media first establishes the idea that any dissent from mainstream view of Asians are from the MRAsians. Then, using the public perception that MRAsians are almost equivalent to white men, disagreeing with the Asian establishment is quote-unquote punching down or mansplaining, and thus does not have any valid standing. This is bullshit. True solidarity comes when groups are able to have free and honest dialogue about difficult conversations. It's no surprise to me that we've still been unable to figure it out, as Asians still do not even consider themselves a unified group. Until we are able to build an independent Asian media platform untethered to mainstream interests, we will never be able to find common ground. Unfortunately, as long as the media is white-controlled and white-owned, there will always be incentives for Asians to turn on one another. While Asians perform well in technical fields such as medicine, law, and finance, media is much more of a subjective field where power is concentrated in the hands of a few decision-makers. Voices that align with pre-approved scripts will be boosted, while those that challenge the status quo will be silenced. Does this mean that every Asian in media is a race traitor or a sellout? Of course not. Some Asian journalists have told me that editors would repeatedly edit their work with unapproved changes or reject their pitches on stories about Asians. But there are many Asians with ambitious career aspirations, like Fang and Talusan, who know that the way to play the game is to cater to mainstream sensibilities and to deny access to those that try to challenge them. Because of the lack of a space where Asians can come in good faith, I have seen time and time again how the conversation unfolds in 8 steps. First, an Asian woman with a white male partner and a large, mostly white audience says something either Orientalists, for example, pathologizing a traumatic personal experience as endemic to one's own race, or colonialists, for example, not finding one's own race attractive, or attributing Asian men to be uniquely misogynist. Second, Asians will then challenge that woman's views. Third, the woman will then dismiss the dissent by virtue of their platform, ironically built by having a mostly white audience. Fourth, Asians will then angrily message that Asian women hateful messages. Fifth, White trolls will then use burner accounts to further fuel the flames by pretending to be Asians on either side of the debate. Sixth, the woman in question then picks the worst of the messages received, ignoring the ones actually coming in good faith, to prove that the harassment they've been receiving and painting all of the dissent as wanting to control Asian women's bodies as a form of sexual commodification. Seventh, the Asians then feel further alienated from the conversation and react defensively and stereotype the Asian figures based on whether they date a white man or not. The Asian women who get caught in the middle report the spillover harassment, further strengthening the narrative that these Asians are all MRAsians. Finally, rinse and repeat as the original unresolved conflict cascades into many more unresolved conflicts. Are Asian men misogynist? Yes, of course, but no less more misogynist than any other man in America. Do some Asian men harass Asian women with misplaced anger? Yes, of course. But I would stop short in claiming that this is exclusively endemic to a specific ethnic community. There are actual Asian men who are white supremacists. These are the true MRAsians, who acknowledge and support white patriarchal supremacy as long as they get a piece of it themselves by aligning themselves with white men. But the term MRAsian is most commonly used as an intellectually bankrupt racist dog whistle that highlights Orientalist stereotypes of backward Asian men coming from misogynistic cultures in an effort to link Asian men to white male supremacist movements. This simple flattening does not account for the very real differences in how society views Asian men and women versus how it views white men and women, and how we respectively behave. For example, Asians are the only race in America where the men voted for Trump, 28%, much less than the Asian women, 40%. Asian women also report the lowest rates of intimate partner violences out of any race. Asian women are the only racial group in America that experience more violence from men of other racial groups versus men from their own race. MRAsian also reduces the concern of emasculation to one's dating or sexual life. There is an Orientalist undercurrent behind these stereotypes, one that implies that Asian men are valued only for their labor, but are not welcome to exist within American social contexts. This affects our basic human needs of a social life, self-image, and mental health. Many of these conversations are new and messy, and Asians are going to get them wrong as we struggle to even find the language to describe our specific lived experiences in America. There are Asian women in media unfairly attacked for simply having a white partner by angry, misguided Asian men, and harassment is not an effective tool for dialogue. But what also needs to be called out is when some Asians designate all disagreement as harassment in order to silence other Asians to avoid having conversation at all. Look, I disagree with many of our Asian identities takes, but I believe in the subreddit's right to exist. My expectation for an honest conversation anytime soon, though, is slim. Why? Throughout virtually all of these discussions, some Asian feminists in media seem to never admit that there are material benefits in dating a white man in America, whether intentional or not. Does this mean that Asian women don't ever face discrimination when dating a white man? Or that Asian men don't have certain privileges as a man? Does this mean that fetishization doesn't come with violent outcomes for Asian women? No, of course not. But it's not mutually exclusive to both have more access to privilege from white power structures, but also suffer from misogyny. When this false dilemma is continually peddled, it leads me to believe that some Asians are still not coming in good faith and are not interested in actual conversations about the real effects of gendered colonialism. Until there is an established media platform that solely represents Asian interests, there will always be people questioning the narrative within the community. Without this, whoever controls the platform in the public square can shape the narrative. My hope is that more Asians start to research their own immigrant history and think critically about the media and how it typically speaks over us instead of with us, so we can start to build our own voices and seize control of our narrative. All right, so that was the end of the episode, or that was the end of the article, rather. I wrote that in October of last year, so that was 2021. But recently, an article came out claiming that smart Asian women were being attacked by misogynist Chinese trolls. Okay, this is the media's attempt to make the idea of MRAsian go global, as if the Chinese are somehow more misogynist and less progressive than the West, despite, the West's sexual assault and harassment figures, as well as, do this for me, Google white men in Asian countries and sexual assault, okay? Tell me what you find. So my conclusion is that, Asian Americans, we have to stay vigilant of these sort of narratives being levied against us, as all the time in media, anti-Asian racism is disguised as criticism against the Communist Party of China. Any article that makes an assertion about a culture's values is 100% categorically racist and is just used to justify that racism. And worse, sometimes it's used for military intervention, as we are clearly seeing fake news being peddled against Iran in the past month. Something like 15,000 protesters were going to be executed. It just makes no sense. Even Justin Trudeau shared a tweet saying that 15,000 protesters were going to be executed, and he dirty deleted because he was an idiot who believed in nonsense. So any Asian American who disseminates articles about gendered racism is not an ally. That Asian American is a quisling. I will be discussing this and the white man's burden 2.0 in the next episode. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, and if you're Asian, feel free to follow any of my socials and DM me for access to the Yellow Knight Discord. All right, peace. So we'll cancel him. Sick the blue checks on him. Because he can take it. Because he's not a hero. He's an annoying guardian. A watchful troll.